The 24th of January, the Media Center is on the air. Your anchor is Svetlana Nechiparenko. We are presenting today a investigation on what happened to the Il-76 over Belgorod. It was a year ago that the airlifter Il-76 crashed over Belgorod. The Russian Federation claimed that the carrier was carrying 65 prisoners of war, and Russia blamed Ukraine for that air crash. We are going to delve into what happened a year ago, what the procedure to that event was. We have Tetiana Katrychenko with us, Executive Director of the Media Initiative for Human Rights, Andriy Yakovlev, the expert on international humanitarian law, Olena Tailakova and Oksana Lozytska representing the families of the POWs. Ms. Tetiana, your organization has conducted an extensive investigation to draw on the chronology of what happened then. What is it that you have now come to know? Welcome, everybody. I appreciate the fact that the families of the prisoners of war are here with us on this day. We have decided to be here with them on this day. Indeed, I was thinking of what I would be talking about, but there is not a lot to say. A year ago, this time, Ukraine knew that over the city of Belgorod in Russia, there was an air crash, and we knew later that it was an IL military transport aircraft headed to the international airport in Belgorod. Later, the lists were published of the 65 prisoners of war held by the Russian Federation, people who allegedly were on board of that aircraft. The Russian Federation claimed that all the people on board died. This very fact is indicative of the fact that in the territory of the Russian Federation, a war crime had taken place, namely the killing of the alleged killing of the Ukrainian prisoners of war. That fact had to be investigated and basically looking into the possibilities of bringing to justice those who were responsible for causing this air crash and the war crime. The Media Initiative for Human Rights is a body that is conducting journalistic investigations in the realm of human rights. We understood from the very beginning that starting with first hour of the first information available had to be gathered about what happened in the Belgorod region. We didn't know then about where the plane was headed. We can only guess. We didn't know who might have been on board of that aircraft. We didn't know the goal of the flight. We didn't know the reason for the downing of the plane. And in general, we had suspicions what kind of aircraft was it and whether the crash had taken place. My colleagues and myself, we were scrupulously gathering all the pieces of information to make sure that we compare the available facts. It is important to note that the Russian side traditionally has blamed for this crime the Ukrainian party. What we was seeing was the development of the events when the Olenivka prison was fired at in July 2024, leading to the deaths of dozens of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Russia traditionally claimed that the place was attacked by the Ukrainian side, explaining it by the fact that previous to that, the Ukrainian military received long-range artillery. Russia also claimed that in this case, the Ukrainian country used the artillery that they had received. We also saw a lot of fake information from the Russian Federation on their official sites and different telegram channels. They were fanning the flames to the effect that the only reason for that downing and air crash and the aftermath and the essence of those messages was that they have been long prepared. What we saw were the messages that had been prepared previously, and we compared those messages with what was said in the aftermath of the Olenivka bombing. We understood that Russia was trying to impact the flow of information on international scale. After all the statements and all the information, it was time to figure out what had really happened. We set a couple of questions that we were trying to find the answer to. First question was the trajectory of the flight, which is to say, to make sure whether this military aircraft, cargo aircraft, was in the area over the international Belgorod airport. Some experts, including international and the Ukrainian ones, figured out that very likely the aircraft was headed from the border with Ukraine. I think we've got that on video. It looked as if the aircraft was headed from the Ukrainian border, and the aircraft that suffered an air crash was not supposed to land in the Belgorod airport. We asked the international experts to say what was happening, and they said that if we look at the procedures of the takeoff and landing in this aircraft, it is very likely that it happened over the Belgorod. Russia claimed that the air crash happened at the height of 4,000 meters. Now we have seen a riddle. How come the aircraft was with that velocity if it was supposed to land in the airport? You see this on the video. The experts that we talked to, many of them, and they said that it's very likely that such a landing, it's called the Afghan landing, when the aircraft wants to make landing as fast as possible, not to be attacked by the air defense. Very likely this version has been taken as an operative one, to the effect that the Il-76 aircraft was supposed to be landing in the Belgorod airport. We also came to know that at that very moment, in the skies of the Belgorod region, there was at least one aircraft carrying prisoners of war. You will remember that on the eve of that day, the Russian Federation claimed, we knew about that there was a prisoners of war swap was being planned. At that time, if we look at how many people were on board of one aircraft, on board of the other cargo military aircraft, and there were prisoners of war en route who were being carried on the road. There were people, to our knowledge, who were not on board. So all together, in some, we are talking about 200 prisoners of war. We can see now the reconstruction of the movement of the prisoners of war who were supposed to be swapped on that day. We asked a lot of Ukrainian prisoners of war who were transported on the 24th of January for the swap, and we know for sure that there was another aircraft carrying Ukrainian prisoners of war from different locations. All of them were transported in the vans to some airport. They spent the night in the settlement of Kamysh-Shaktinsky, and on the next day, on the 24th of January, they were put on board, and that other aircraft was diverted after the air crash. We know the places where these prisoners of war were coming from, and allegedly they were supposed to be going along the same route as the first one, the one that was downed. What is important is that for a long time it was not clear. Nothing was clear about the routes, about the swap per se. Neither did we know anything about the names. Our colleagues from the Freedom Radio, they confirmed that on that day the crew of the Russian Il-76 died, and they were quickly buried. And there were also 3 people on board who were watching our prisoners. Those were killed as well. We know for sure that the prisoners of war swap was supposed to have taken place. They were carried for a swap on board of the aircraft. The aircraft that was downed over the Belgorod, that's for sure, but we don't know whether the prisoners of war from Ukraine were on board. I don't want to publicize all the options and versions from the former prisoners of war who were also swapped that very day. Other prisoners of war who were in captivity with the people who were allegedly on board. There are a lot of versions here. We managed to find information about 21 of the 65 POWs who were seen in January of that year in the territory of the Russian Federation. They were held in general cells, not in the solitary confinement cells. They were seen. Their state of health, how do I say it, was relatively stable. As an organization gathering witnesses, we know about the different circumstances and conditions of how our prisoners of war are held. So there is no reason to claim that any person that we have identified could have been killed or murdered in the place of detention. All the people who on the 23rd of January were alive, and at different times they were moved from their cells and they were moved elsewhere. The last point that I want to share is this. There are a couple of details that I have failed to shed light on, but my point is that this is the first step towards identifying the objective truth of what happened in the territory of the Belgorod region. The investigation is not over. This project is to gather as many facts as possible to identify the chronology and the timeline of what had happened, not to lose any screenshot, any piece of information, and we are also gathering information of the experts to investigate further. Why are we doing this? As I have mentioned, we are engaged in investigating the human rights violations. That's one point. The second point is that we have a lot of expertise in talking to the family members of the prisoners of war in Olenivka when it was attacked. We saw a lot of disoriented people who didn't know what had happened. They didn't receive enough information from investigative bodies of Ukraine. They were left alone. They were inundated by the incoming information, they were writing letters to different commissioners, to the presidential administration. This is very difficult for people who have learned first about the fact that their relatives are prisoners of war, and secondly, they came to know that allegedly their relatives and loved ones were on board of that plane. They're in the information vacuum. And of course, our colleagues turned to us, both Ukrainian and international media, and they were asking, why is it that we don't know anything about this? That's why we tried to figure out what had happened. This is our way to support the families. We'll tell them from the outset. We will be standing with them as long as it takes, and we will do our best to support them in terms of information, legal procedures. This is why we believe this investigation, even given that we have failed to identify all the information objective, but in general, this project is important. My colleague will tell you about the responsibility factor. Now, we cannot name a single name, but there is a logic of the international humanitarian law that can explain some points. Tetiana, before we go over to the legal issues, let me clarify one point. Who are the international or Ukrainian body that you are cooperating with? And the information that you received, where did you get it from? We cooperate with a number of international and Ukrainian institutions. I will not name particular titles. The official information that we know now will be shared with all the stakeholders. What we have now in our file seems to be making up 30% of what we can get. We have tried to generalize all the facts that we can be sure in. There are a lot of versions that have to be corroborated and checked. Perhaps we will also listen to the families of the prisoners of war. Indeed, Olena, Oksana, perhaps Ms. Tailakova, we will begin with you. Will you share with you your story? What do you know about your loved ones? My name is Olena Tailakova. I am a former wife of the Ukrainian military man Tailakov. I appreciate the fact that this issue has been highlighted. Recently, we have confronted indifference coming from the Ukrainian and international organizations. We have a lot of questions, and there are no answers to our questions. That is to say, why has it happened? Who is responsible for the events? Why the information staff didn't cooperate with us? We have also an issue with the International Red Cross. All our loved ones were confirmed to be prisoners of war by the Red Cross. We know that the International Red Cross officials visited different places where our loved ones were held. We requested to get some information, and we had no answer. We don't know where our relatives can be. There isn't information that Russia claimed that they gave back the remnants of our loved ones on the 8th of November. Unfortunately, there is no official information whether these are really the remnants of our loved ones. The information is not available. We don't know who was postponing that process, and this is the place we would like to know what is the fate of our loved ones. Oksana, could you share with us your story? What are the communicational problems with you? Welcome. Olena has just said major issues that we are troubled with. I was expecting my son. I received a phone call on that day at 9 o'clock in the evening. And this voice told me, your son will be back in Ukraine next day. I was so calm. I didn't recognize myself, and I thought to myself, currently, we've done a lot of work, and this is the event that should have happened. We breathed freely. We were hoping that we would meet our relatives and my son on the 24th of January. No, on the night, on the 23rd of January, I boarded the train and I went to the capital city. What happened on the 24th of January was in front of my eyes because I was there in the coordination center. And I've got a lot of issues with the coordination center. I can't really now tell you all of my questions. Perhaps as we go along, I will verbalize my issues. Have you been contacted by the officers of the information center? Do you know anything about what are the time when you are likely to get any information? Coordination staff don't turn to us. My inference is that they want to lay the blame with our investigator, and I appreciate what the investigating officer is doing for us. He is always answering all our questions. Of course, there are different responses to the information we receive from our investigating officer, but I appreciate what he is doing. Shall I put it this? He is the one to be blamed for everything. He is a young, nice person. He is here with us. And, you know, sometimes I feel sorry for him as a mother, and I will be honest with you, because he's supposed to be a scapegoat, as the coordination center sees. I am frustrated by what they are doing. Indeed, we know that the whole society and the loved one want to know what had happened. Andriy, can I turn to you? Shall we talk about the legal side of the issue from the point of view of the international humanitarian law? What had happened in the Belgorod region, and is Ukraine to blame? International humanitarian law, or as they say, customs and rules of war, is the right of fact. We have to understand what are the facts. We have to look back to what happened at the early in the year, in the middle of the year. We saw the constant bombardment of the city of Kharkiv, and we couldn't do anything about it. It's clear that we wanted to oppose the situation. They were opposing us. That is to say, when Ukrainian air defense was concentrated there, the Russians responded accordingly. The inference that we can say is that the Belgorod region was the hostility zone. We are talking not only about air defense, Ukrainian ones and the Russian ones. Basically, Belgorod region was constantly under the attack of the Ukrainian drones, and of course they were confronted. So we can say safely that this is the area where air defense was so thickly present. When the prisoners of war, they are of course combatants, but they are enjoying the status of the prisoners of war. That is to say, they cannot be a military legitimate target. They have to be respected as prisoners of war, and their rights must be respected. The Third Geneva Convention proclaims that prisoners of war cannot be placed in the vicinity of the combat zone. The 23rd part said that prisoners of war cannot be moved to the places where they can be in danger. It doesn't say where the danger comes from. We now know for sure that the Russian air defense is capable of hitting the civilian aircraft. We know the Boeing that was downed by the Russian military. The Hague court has identified and established. We have seen recently what happened to the Azerbaijani commercial aircraft. That is to say that they claim that their air defense do not target commercial aircraft. And they're claiming that they cannot do it. This is to say that if somebody is transporting the prisoners of war to the area where there is a danger for anybody, they're putting in danger and putting the people at risk. Another example is this: when somebody goes there to a place where he or she is likely to die without a prior warning, we tell somebody, you go in that direction where there are skirmishes and firings. That is to say that effectively our behavior constitutes an intent that leads to the lethal consequences. In other words, the second point is this: this is a combat zone. Second point is that there are people whose responsibility it is to ensure the safety of the prisoners of war where they are not in danger. International humanitarian law talks about the measures of safety. We don't know whether the Russians secure these safety measures, whether they warned our prisoners of war. We know for sure that they don't communicate with anybody. They wouldn't allow anybody to get in contact with the place. We know that they're completely closed. And if they are closing all the information, we can infer through this logic that if they were sure that it wasn't them, they did it. There was no reason to do it. Could be used as a propaganda. But we now know that Russia is doing that on purpose. We know the facts, and we know the perfidious actions. We know that prisoners of war were in that region, and they're enjoying the status of prisoners of war. And of course, this is the area of the Russian air defense operating. The Rome Statute, including the Article 30, says that there is an evil intent that constitutes a crime. Now I don't know any information who shot down the aircraft, but I know for sure that the party that was aware of the danger is responsible for committing a war crime. Other circumstances are not known to us, but what we know that Russia wouldn't grant access to that area, and they don't communicate anything on what had happened. We have to figure out what had happened in reality and what had led to that downing. But the party that is directly in the know of the possibility that their air defense can down such an aircraft are responsible for that downing. Given the fact that even they didn't do it, it doesn't mean that they are not responsible. You know, we are talking about a situation when we create conditions for a murder. For example, a person is forced to jump down the cliff. You see, it wasn't, the person who committed such a crime forced, although it physically didn't assault such a person. Another point to follow up what Andriy has said. After we received the news that a military cargo aircraft was downed over Belgorod, Russia claimed that it was the Ukrainians who do it. Ukrainians knew about the swap, and the Ukrainians didn't observe the regime of silence. Indeed, we knew that the swap was planned and that the prisoners of war were likely to be on board. But we also know that at the point when the air crash happened, the Russian party, in spite of the fact that they talk about the fact that it didn't do it, they didn't keep silent about this planned swap. The air raids were on, both in Belgorod and on Ukrainian side of the border. In the sky over the Belgorod region, there were other aircraft that were likely to fire at the Ukrainian territory. So Russia didn't keep the silence regime, and it is easy to prove. Secondly, Russia was very assured, self-assured, that they could use this this place to, in effect, the swap. We know that the Russian party was using this airfield for other purposes, and Il-76 airlifters were used for military purposes. My point is that Russians did everything to use our prisoners of war as a shield. Either we are talking about this group of 65 or the previous instances. They were sure that nothing would happen because they were using our prisoners of war as a shield. Journalists, if you have questions, you can raise up your hand and you will be given the microphone. Maria Nabuhan from the TV channel 1+1. I have a clarification that I would like to ask the family members. Now, of course, it would be very good if the investigative officer also took the floor. You said that on the 8th of November, the remnants of the prisoners of war were given back. Have there been any DNA tests or anything? And if I could turn to the investigative officers, what officially can you tell us? Where are we now? At what stage of investigation are we now in? Let us ask whether the investigative officer can publicly take the floor. No, this is not the place for him to take the floor. I will tell you the following. Officially, we don't have any information about DNA information. As far as I know, there is no confirmation that the DNA corresponds to our samples. So they officially are now prisoners of war. Do you have other questions or clarifications? Let me tell you the following. When bodies are returned from the Ukrainian places of where the prisoners of war are held, the DNA tests take quite a long period of time in Ukraine. We also know that international experts might get on board to identify with more clarity what bodies have been returned to Ukraine. We cannot hope for a fast-forward procedure here. I would also like to add, on behalf of all the 65 families, even after all the tests have been conducted, and there is a confirmation that these are bodies of our loved ones, we will demand that the international independent test be conducted. We want to be sure. Very unfortunately, I'm not talking about the aggressor state, but the way that we have been treated by the Ukrainian authorities. It's now for a year. We have been left alone with this terrible situation. There is no official body in Ukraine that would take care of us. Everything that we have achieved, all the information that we have had, this is what we have done on our own. We have initiated family members who are very socially active. Some people, of course, confronting such a situation for the first time in their lives. So we have been left alone. We will go to the very end of this process. We will not silently agree to what we are told. No, we will be fighting till the very end. We want to have an international independent DNA test. We want to see the investigation of the air defense, whether the regime of the silence was being observed, and this will happen after we have been recognized as the victims. Now we are like puppies, the blind puppies. We don't know where to go and why to go. As for the investigation, on the 26th of January, we were summoned, the families were summoned to the coordination staff, and we were told that Ukraine would do everything to make sure that our boys come back. They didn't know whether our loved ones were dead or alive. And every prisoners of war swap will include the names of our loved ones. We were offered, not offered, but we were given an offer by the Russian Federation to the effect that the family members can go to the Russian Federation and provide their DNA samples. We refused outright. The international organizations and different countries where we are ready to provide our DNA samples. What I'm troubled with now, and now what I am anxious about, is that on the 16th of February, we were summoned again to the coordination center. It was quite a difficult meeting in terms of the atmosphere. An expert on DNA samples was talking to us. It was clear that he is a very good expert, and it took him 40 minutes to say that if the bodies have been given back, it would be enough to have a piece of any part of body, an air. We would be able to identify when the person died, under what circumstances he or she died, the causes of death. Unfortunately, we didn't make a notice of his name. We were listening to him, and all the 65 families were crying. What I want to see is this particular expert and ask him, because we are told now it is quite difficult to identify the date of death, the time of death. Where is that expert who promised us? There were 65 families present. And another point, I will be fighting to the end. Currently, if the DNA of my son is confirmed, I want to know the date of his death, because I want to put that date on his tomb. So I am going to fight. As for the DNA, in reality, when such examinations take place, it is quite difficult to identify, especially in terms of comparing DNA tests. Unless you have done, we need to preserve what you have available now, whether some pieces of his clothes, or perhaps when he shaved, there are some remnants of the hair or beard. Another point to add is this. You asked whether Ukraine is responsible. It is easy to talk because our authorities are available. This is not Russia. We can raise these issues with them. But let us go back to the situation when it happened. In reality, I remember that there's an airfield housed anti-aircraft systems S-300. We don't know whether the warning was issued or the warning wasn't issued. But we know that these aircraft were targeted as military targets. So, apart from the fact that we will have some information at a later stage, but we must know now that the Russian Federation, by directing the prisoners of war to the area that might be in the area of the air defense activities, they committed a war crime. They're supposed to preserve the lives of the prisoners of war. You know, the geeks talk about the full safety devices. Somebody must be responsible. I believe that Russia is culpable of this war crime. I think we could wrap up here. I would like to respond to what Andriy has suggested. The major point is this. We cannot claim currently that we can identify those responsible for the crime. But Oksana has rightly suggested, after all the circumstances have been identified, Ukraine, all of us, are quite different from Russia, from the Russian population. We don't want to distort the information. We don't want to cover, the architecture of this crime without additional details. But we must be aware that the truth that will be told at some point in time must be truth. It must be very exact, and we have to name all the culpable persons. The Russian Federation as an aggressor state, the state that has captured and is capturing prisoners of war and is holding them in terrible conditions, is transporting them in the military cargo aircraft. This all goes to say that Russia wants to enjoy the freedom from responsibility, which is to say that we are facing two challenges. One is to identify all the circumstances. Two, we want to have those who have committed these war crimes must be held to responsibility. I have a question in terms of legal aspects. At the beginning of this briefing, you said there are no data available to lay the blame with the Ukrainian military. And you wrapped up with the issue of war crimes. You also mentioned that the aircraft in that airfield were used to carry the military loads. Could you comment whether you have authentic information? What is the result that you have received? And a clarification here. The investigation said that early in January, the Ukrainian investigators said that the bodies that were given back to Ukraine on the 8th of November, there were some correspondences in terms of DNA samples. Do you have any information on that? And Oksana, when you mentioned the 24th of January last year, you said that you were at the coordination center. You said that there are a lot of issues that you have with them. You said that you didn't want to verbalize those issues at the beginning. Can you do it now? I didn't get your question Do you want me to describe what happened on the 24th of January last year? You mentioned that there are a lot of issues. You were at the coordination center, and you said that what you saw there was the reason to have a lot of questions. Now that I analyze what had happened on the 24th of January, my presumption is it's the Ukrainian side that shot down the aircraft. Do you want to know where I got that information? What makes me think that it was the Ukrainian party? You see, I was there. I entered the place on the 9th of at 9 o'clock. I was offered some coffee, and they told me, "Why have you come here?" All the families went to the place where the swap would take place. And they told me not to share information with anybody about the fact that my son was supposed to be next day in Ukraine. And they told me this is not a good place for you to come to, because everybody has left for the place of the swap. And I asked them whether my son was on the list. At the reception desk, they told me, "We don't know what the lists are." That's it. I sat on the sofa, looking at the screen of my smartphone, and what I see is some panic going on. I didn't pay enough attention to what was going around. But there were tears. There were frustrated faces, hysterics. Panic was there. This is what I witnessed. People smoked in some areas where general public are not supposed to be there, and I glanced and peeped into that place, and I understood that these officers were under panic attack, and they were very hysterical. And my conclusion was that it was the Ukrainian side that shot down the plane. I would gladly be wrong, but this is what I am living with. My eldest son gathers all the information. I was contacted by other families, and this is what we are living with, and lived until the bodies were returned to Ukraine. Another point that I would like to make is this. It is very surprising that after the Russians said that the bodies were repatriated, and there are allegedly bodies from the Il-76 aircraft. The coordination center behaves in a very odd and strange way. And I received a letter recently from the coordination center to the effect that so far, and it was dated 14th of December, to the effect Russia so far has not returned the body of the people who have been allegedly killed on board of that aircraft. And I was indignant about that. We are providing our DNA samples. There are other actions, and here I receive a letter from the coordination center with such a message. My indignation, I can't tell you what I felt. I was very much frustrated, and I was taken by hysterics, and all the families experienced the same. Of course, this is an acceptable mistake. Oksana, could you comment on the question that you faced? The question about the fact that there might have been military equipment on board of that aircraft, and there are some statements there is not enough evidence of that. Did you check that kind of information? Perhaps you might have identified other kind of information. We were checking the information. The first version was that on board of that aircraft, only military loads including the prisoners of war and other military equipment, but we haven't received any confirmation to the effect that there were ammunition on board together with the POWs. Of course, witnesses can't tell for sure that were on the second aircraft. They were blindfolded, they didn't see each other, but at this point in time, this is an issue to be investigated. So far, we haven't found the answer. Thank you very much. Let me remind you, we've been talking and representation about what had happened to the Il-76 over Belgorod. We will resume our work in 5 minutes' time. We will concentrate on the safety rules in the winter time. Stay tuned.